I witnessed a crime, and now my life will never be the same. History 1. It all started on an ordinary day when I was heading home from work. Little did I know that encounter would change my life forever. It was just another crisp autumn day. I had been working at the same office for 2 years, and everything in my life felt predictable. The same routine day after day. I would wake up, go to work, take the bus, and return home in the evening to relax, eat, and go to bed. Nothing ever changed. But on this particular day, something felt off. I felt an unusual exhaustion weighing me down, and for some reason, I decided to change my usual route home. Instead of walking through the familiar park, I decided to take a shortcut through a narrow alley I had never used before. I didn't think much of it at the time, but looking back, I realized how that small decision altered the course of everything. As I walked through the alley, I noticed a man standing outside an old, dimly lit store. He was staring at something in his hands, trying to hide whatever it was from view. He looked strange, almost out of place, and his body language made me feel uneasy. I tried to ignore it and walk past, but something inside me told me to pay attention. I quickened my pace, and just as I was about to turn the corner, I heard footsteps behind me. When I glanced over my shoulder, I saw the same man following me. His eyes were intense, and his movements were swift. "Don't look at me," he whispered from behind. "Just keep walking." My heart started racing, and I instinctively picked up my pace. I felt like I was trapped in a nightmare. I kept walking forward, trying not to look back, but curiosity gnawed at me. The man was gaining on me, his footsteps echoing against the quiet street. Suddenly, he grabbed my arm, forcing me to stop. "Listen to me," he hissed, his breath cold on my neck. "You saw something you weren't supposed to see. Now you're involved in something bigger than you think." I froze. What did he mean? What I witnessed? My mind raced, but before I could ask, he released my arm and turned, vanishing into the shadows. I stood there, frozen, unsure what just happened. I didn't know it yet, but that brief encounter would set off a chain of events that would change everything about my life. I tried to forget about the encounter, but the days that followed only brought more questions and fear. For the next few days, I tried to go about my life as usual. But no matter how hard I tried to push that strange encounter from my mind, something inside me kept telling me that I was in danger. It started with small things, the hairs on the back of my neck standing up whenever I went out, a strange feeling that someone was watching me. At first, I brushed it off as paranoia, but then I noticed something I couldn't ignore. I started seeing unfamiliar faces, people I didn't recognize, standing on street corners, walking past my apartment building, watching me from across the street. I couldn't shake the feeling that they were following me. One evening, I received a strange text message from an unknown number. The message was short but chilling. "You don't know what you've seen, but we know you do. Don't talk to anyone. Stay quiet, and everything will be fine." My heart sank. Who was sending these messages? How did they know what happened? Was I being watched? The weight of it all started to sink in. The next day, while I was walking to work, I saw him again, the same man. This time, he was standing directly across from my building, staring at me. His eyes were cold and unblinking. There was no mistaking it. He had found me again. I could feel the panic rising in my chest. I tried to look away, but I couldn't. His gaze was hypnotic, like he was trying to send some kind of silent message. He didn't approach me this time, but I knew that something was coming, and it wasn't going to be good. That evening, I received another message. "We know you saw us. Don't think you're safe. You've made a choice, and now you're part of this. There's no turning back." I tried to pretend that everything was fine, but the truth began to sink in. I was in way over my head. The following days were a blur. I tried to live normally, go to work, meet with friends, but the constant sense of being watched was too overwhelming. Every time I stepped outside, it felt like eyes were on me. It was like I had become part of a shadow world I couldn't escape. I started to notice more strange things, small, unsettling details that didn't add up. A car would always be parked outside my apartment building. A van would follow me as I walked to the bus stop, and the same strangers would be there, lurking in the background. I couldn't trust anyone anymore. It felt like I was being pushed into a corner, and the walls were closing in. One evening, as I was sitting at home, I heard a knock on my door. I hesitated, wondering who it could be. When I opened the door, the man from the alley was standing there, his face even more serious than before. "You don't have much time," he said, his voice cold and emotionless. "You've seen things you weren't meant to see. Now you're part of it. You can't turn back." Before I could react, he turned and walked away. I closed the door, my heart racing. Was I really involved in something dangerous? Could I trust what he was saying? Or was he just trying to manipulate me into being quiet? The next day, I received yet another message. "Your silence is the only thing keeping you safe. If you speak, it will all come crashing down." I knew I couldn't ignore the situation any longer. It was too late to back out. I was in this whether I liked it or not. It became clear to me that I had no choice but to confront the reality of what was happening. I was caught in something much bigger than myself, and I needed answers. Every time I tried to walk away, the shadows would follow me, growing darker and more threatening. One evening, the man appeared again, but this time he wasn't alone. Two others stood behind him, their faces unreadable. They all wore dark suits, and their presence felt menacing. "You've been given a choice," the man said, his tone grave. "Stay silent, stay out of it, and your life will return to normal. Help us, and your family will be protected. But speak out, and everything will fall apart." I could see the seriousness in their eyes. They weren't bluffing. This wasn't just some game. It was real, and if I didn't comply, I could lose everything: my friends, my family, my freedom. I knew that if I spoke up, I would be risking everything. But staying silent meant being part of something I didn't understand. I didn't know what I was supposed to do, but I knew I had to make a choice, and soon. In the end, I decided to dig deeper to find out the truth. But the deeper I went, the more I realized that the truth would cost me everything. I couldn't stand being in the dark any longer. The more I tried to ignore the situation, the more it consumed me. I began investigating everything I could about the people involved. And what I uncovered was far worse than I had imagined. They were part of a criminal syndicate, involved in everything from political corruption to illegal arms dealing. And somehow, I had stumbled into the middle of it. The man, who I had thought was just a random stranger, was actually one of their key players. I knew that now there was no turning back. If I wanted to get out of this alive, I had to expose them. But I also knew that doing so would put me and my family in grave danger. The choice was clear: stay silent and live in fear, or risk everything to stop them. I chose to fight back. But as I took my first steps toward the truth, I realized that the cost of that truth was higher than I ever could have imagined. History 2. It started on an ordinary night. What I thought was a typical evening at the bar turned into something that would change my life forever. It was an average Friday evening. I had just finished a long week at work, and I was looking forward to some time to unwind. I met up with some friends at a local bar, a small but cozy place where we would gather every week to relax. We were just having drinks and chatting about life, nothing out of the ordinary. I never expected the night to take a turn that would haunt me for the rest of my life. I was sitting near the back, nursing my beer when I saw him, a man I had never seen before. He was sitting alone at the far corner of the bar, his eyes glued to something on his phone. At first, I didn't think much of it, but something about him caught my attention. He was in his late 30s, dressed in a simple jacket, but there was a certain tension in his posture, like he was constantly on alert. As the night went on, I noticed that he kept glancing around, his eyes darting toward the door and the people in the room. I was starting to get a little uncomfortable. Maybe it was the alcohol, or maybe it was just my overactive imagination, but it seemed like he was watching everyone around him. Then, something strange happened. A man in a suit walked into the bar, immediately heading straight to the guy in the corner. They exchanged a few words, and after a brief handshake, the suited man left. I couldn't help but feel that something was off about the whole exchange. The man in the corner stared after him for a long time, his face tight with anxiety. I should have ignored it. I should have turned my attention back to my friends and continued enjoying the evening. But something urged me to stay alert. I noticed the man in the corner slip something into his jacket pocket. It was quick, but my eyes caught the flash of what seemed like a small envelope. It didn't seem like much at the time, but now I realized that moment was the beginning of everything. The following week, I tried to put the bizarre experience out of my mind, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. A few days later, I was at work, trying to focus on a report I had to finish by the end of the day. But my mind kept drifting back to the man in the bar. What was he doing there? Who was he meeting? And what was in that envelope? I couldn't help but replay the scene over and over again in my head. That's when I first started noticing the changes. I began to feel like I was being followed. It was subtle at first, a feeling of someone watching me when I walked down the street, a sense of unease whenever I turned a corner. It wasn't until the third day that I saw him again, the man from the bar. He was standing across the street from my office building, his eyes fixed on me. I tried to dismiss it as coincidence, but deep down, I knew it wasn't. Something was happening, and I had unwittingly become part of it. The next day, as I left work, I was approached by a stranger in the alley behind the building. He was tall, wearing a dark coat, and his face was partially obscured by a hat. Without saying a word, he handed me a small envelope. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. "Don't open it here," he said, his voice low and urgent. "They're watching." Before I could respond, he turned and disappeared into the shadows. My mind was racing as I stood there, holding the envelope in my hand. Was this related to the man from the bar? Who were they? And why had I been chosen to be involved in whatever was happening? I didn't open the envelope right away. Instead, I stuffed it into my bag and tried to forget about it. But I couldn't. Over the next few days, the feeling of being watched only intensified. Every time I went out, I saw unfamiliar faces, people who seemed to be keeping an eye on me. The paranoia was eating away at me. One night, I opened the envelope. Inside, there was a single piece of paper with a simple message. "Meet us at the old warehouse on 5th Street. Midnight. Come alone." There was no signature, no indication of who had sent it. But I knew one thing for sure. My life was about to change forever. I couldn't ignore the message. I had to find out what was going on, but I didn't realize the danger I was walking into. That night, I found myself standing in front of the old warehouse on 5th Street, feeling a mixture of fear and curiosity. The building was abandoned, its windows boarded up and covered in grime. The area was eerily quiet, and the air felt thick with tension. I hesitated for a moment before pushing open the rusted door. Inside, the warehouse was dimly lit, the only light coming from a single overhead bulb hanging in the center of the room. My heart raced as I slowly stepped inside, my footsteps echoing in the emptiness. Suddenly, I heard a voice. "You came." I turned to see the man from the bar, standing in the shadows. This time, he wasn't alone. Two others stood beside him, both dressed in dark suits and with expressions that were hard to read. They didn't look like criminals, but there was something cold and dangerous about them. "What is this?" I asked, my voice shaky. "Why am I here?" The man stepped forward, his eyes piercing. "We need your help. You've seen something you weren't supposed to see, and now you're involved. I stared at him, confused. I don't understand. What are you talking about? He sighed, clearly frustrated. You're not just a witness. You're part of something much bigger now, and if you don't cooperate, there will be consequences. The two men beside him stepped forward, their eyes locking onto mine. You can walk away, but it won't be easy, one of them said. You've been marked. I felt a chill run down my spine. Marked? By who? That's not important right now, the man said. What matters is that you make a choice. You can help us, or you can disappear. But if you choose to speak about this, or try to involve the authorities, things will get ugly. Trust me. Before I could respond, they turned and walked out of the warehouse, leaving me alone in the silence. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, trying to process what had just happened. In the days that followed, I was left with one choice: cooperate with these people or risk my life trying to escape. But as I dug deeper, I realized that escape wasn't an option. Over the next few weeks, I tried to go back to my normal life, but it was impossible. The constant surveillance, the cryptic messages, the feeling of being hunted, it all made me feel like I was trapped in a nightmare. I couldn't tell anyone. I couldn't trust anyone. Every time I even thought about talking to the police, the warning flashed in my mind. If you speak, everything will fall apart. I did some digging on my own. I checked news reports, searched for any information that might explain what was happening to me, but it only made things worse. There were no leads, no clues. The people I had encountered were connected to something vast and dangerous, a shadow organization that had its hands in everything from politics to criminal activities. They were untouchable, and now I was in their sights. I was being forced into a corner. My only option was to comply, to find out what they wanted from me, and hope that I could find a way out before it was too late. Things took a darker turn when I learned just how deep I was in. The organization I was dealing with wasn't just involved in crime. They were involved in something much worse. I was approached by the man from the bar again, this time in a much more ominous setting, a deserted alleyway in the dead of night. He told me everything, or at least as much as he could without giving away too much. They control everything, he said, his voice low. The government, the media, the banks, everything. And now they're using you to get to something even bigger. You're the key to something they need. I didn't know whether to trust him or not, but deep down, I knew I had no choice but to listen. I'd already been pulled into this web, and there was no going back. In the end, I had to make the hardest decision of my life, to stand up against the organization or become part of it. But as I prepared for the fight ahead, I realized that whatever path I chose, nothing would ever be the same. The pressure was overwhelming. The organization had made it clear that I had no way out unless I cooperated fully. But the more I learned about them, the more I realized that if I didn't stop them now, they would continue to destroy everything. I made my choice. I would fight back, but I didn't realize just how dangerous that decision would be. As I took my first steps toward bringing them down, I understood that this was no longer just a fight for my survival. It was a fight for everything I held dear, and the price of victory would be higher than I ever imagined.